An evening mist, salted by the western sea, was gathering on the low hills, reed-spattered rises running up from the rocks, then back into the gorse and bracken-covered country, and onto the roads that joined the villages, where lamps and candles flickered behind the shutters of the grey stone houses. It was poor country. So poor, remarked the curé, who had recently arrived from Angers, that the stones of the shore called out for God's mercy. With the mist came sputtering rain, made invisible by the extinguished light, as it exploded like flung gravel at the windows, while stronger gusts made the shivering pine trees shed their needles on the dark, sanded earth. Jacques Rebière listened to the sounds from outside as he looked through the window of his bedroom for a moment. A dim moon allowed him to see clouds foaming in the darkness. The weather reminded him often that it was not just he at 16 years old who was young, but all mankind, a species that took infant steps on the drifts and faults of the earth. Between the ends of his dirtied fingers, Jacques held a small blade, which over the course of several days he had whetted to surgical sharpness. He pulled a candle closer. From downstairs he could hear the sound of his father's voice in reluctant negotiation. The house was at the top of a narrow street that ran off the main square of Saint-Agnès. Behind it, the village ended, and there were thick woods. Monsieur Rebière's own property, where Jacques was meant to trap birds and rabbits and prevent other villagers from doing likewise. The garden had an orchard of pear and apple trees whose fruits were collected and set to keep in one of the outbuildings. Rebière's was a house of many stores, of sheds with beaten earth underfoot and slatted wooden shelves, of brick-floored cellars with stone bins on which the cobwebs closed with access to the bottles, of barred pantry and latched larder with trays of nuts and preserved fruits. The keys were on a ring in the pocket of Rebière's waistcoat. Although born no more than 60 years earlier, he was known as Old Rebière, perhaps for the arthritic movement of his knees when he heaved himself up from his chair and straightened the joints beneath his breeches. He preferred to do business standing up. It gave the transaction a temporary air, helping to convince the other party that bargaining time was short. Old Rebière was a forester who worked as the agent for a landowner from Lorient. Over the years, he'd done some business on his own account, acquiring some parcels of land, 3 cottages that the heirs did not want to keep, some fields and woodland. Most of his work was no more than that of bailiff or rent collector, but he liked to try to negotiate private deals with a view to becoming a businessman in his own right. Born in the year after Waterloo, he had lived in a republic, 3 kings and an emperor, twice mayor of the local town. He had found it made little difference which government was in Paris, since so few edicts devolved from the distant centre to his own Breton world. The parlour of the house had smoke-stained wooden panelling and a white stone chimney-piece decorated with the carved head of a wild boar. A small fire was smouldering in the grate as Rebière attempted to conclude his meeting with a notary who had come to see him. He never invited guests into his study, but preferred to speak to them in his public room as though he might later need witnesses to what had passed between them. His second wife sat in her accustomed chair by the door sewing and listening. Rebière's tactic was to say as little as possible. He had found that silence, accompanied by pained inhalation, often induced nervousness in the other side. His contributions, when they were unavoidable, were delivered in a reluctant murmur, melancholy, full of weariness at a world that had obliged him to agree to terms so self-wounding. "I'm not a peasant," he told his son. "I'm not one of those men you see portrayed at the theatre in Paris who buries his gold in a sock and never buys a bonnet for his wife. I'm a businessman who understands the modern world." From upstairs, Jacques could still hear his father's business murmur. It was true that he was not a peasant, though his parents had been. True, too, that he was not the miser of the popular imagination, though partly because the amount of gold he had to hoard was not great enough. 40 years of dealing had brought him a modest return, and perhaps, thought Jacques, this was why his father had forbidden him to study any further.